A radical look at Scottish history with Stuart McHardy. 12. Declaration of Arbroath. In 1320, Scotland was still being threatened by the English King Edward II, and King Robert I was still under excommunication. But Pope John had recently placed Scotland under a papal interdict, supposedly for continually mounting raids into England. That this was done at the behest of the English king, who was intent on subjugating Scotland, is ironic, to put it mildly. What this meant was that the international situation was even more precarious than it had been as a result of King Robert's excommunication. So, in a remarkable piece of international diplomacy, a group of Scottish notables put their signatures to a document said to have been written by Bernard, Abbot of Arbroath, which was then sent to the Pope John XXII. Now, over the years there's been considerable discussion of the possibility that this document had a strong influence on the American Declaration of Independence, and many people have seen it as a seminal document in the development of human rights. Yet there are those who maintain that ideas at the time were so significantly different from modern times that we should resist making such claims. I would suggest that it is not coincidental that most of the latter are of an establishment persuasion, which, in contemporary terms in Scotland, certainly suggests unionism. That the document was intended to remind the Pope that Scotland was, in fact, a sovereign nation, a nation that had existed longer than the country of the king trying to conquer them, and that the hope was to lift not just the interdict, but King Robert's excommunication, is not in doubt. The need for it had initially been brought about by Pope Clement V's recognition of Edward I's claim of suzerainty over Scotland as far back as 1305, which had coincided with Bruce being excommunicated for killing John Comyn in a church. It was apparently the locale of this crime rather than the crime itself, which was a significant point. It is important, however, to realise just how groundbreaking the document of 1320 was, and there are several very telling sections in it, some of which have been mentioned before. All nations have stories of their origin, some, like the later English one, that claimed Britain to be one united country due to the fact it having been initially put together by Brutus after the Trojan Wars, can be clearly seen as fictitious attempts to use classical knowledge to create a political framework for advantage. However, in the Declaration of Arbroath there is something that is potentially of a different order indeed. In it the claim is made that the Scots came from Greater Scythia, over the Tyrrhenian Sea, which is part of the Mediterranean of Italy, then spent time in Spain before coming north to Ireland and Scotland. As Ewan Campbell showed in his paper, Were the Scots Irish, which you can access on Electric Scotland's website, the idea that the Scots came into Argyll from Ulster around 500 does not hold up, but the rest of the story is intriguing. Modern research, including DNA research, has shown that these islands were populated, or potentially repopulated, after the last ice age by people who were up till then living in northern Spain, in what is known as a refugium. In other Scottish sources from the same period, the story is given that the Scots were in fact descended from Scota, a daughter of the Pharaoh. Now, while all medieval origin myths are coloured by the Christian and classical leanings of the scribes who put them together, here we may be seeing something different. As far back as the 1970s, it was noted that some of the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories in Australia described creatures that had been extinct for over 30,000 years. Memories of these long-dead creatures could only have come down through oral transmission, as the native Australians had no written language. My own long-term researches into the Nine Maidens phenomenon suggest it is possible that the particular widespread motif could have come out of Africa with the first humans a very, very long time ago indeed. These are stories that have survived in human communities since long before the idea of the nation-state was ever thought of, never mind literature. Even in our modern world, genealogy has a strong hold on many people's interest, and it is an integral part of all tribal societies that a part of what holds them together is the sense of shared identity and common origin. In this reference to the Scots having been in Spain, and in the others to an African origin, are we in fact seeing traces of something that had survived in oral tradition? A memory of the far distant past, perhaps? In the 14th century, literacy was extremely limited, and the oral tradition would have been very strong in both the Scots and Gaelic-speaking communities, and it is undeniable that knowledge of the human refugium in northern Spain during the last ice age was a very long way off then. One quote from the Declaration that has been used extensively is, "As long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule." While it is a great shame that the parcel of rogues who sold Scotland out in 1707 had forgotten that line, the passage preceding it has considerable significance, which I have mentioned before. Referring to King Robert, it says, "Yet if he should give up what he has begun, and agree to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own rights and ours, and make some other man who is well able to defend us as our king." Now, many modern commentators have seen this particular section as laying the grounds for the idea that the governors can only rule by the consent of the governed. And it has considerable significance in light of the fact that in Scotland, the people are sovereign, while the doctrine of the supreme sovereignty of the British Parliament is an English concept. However, there's potentially even more to this. This concept of removing the king, if he will not do what is required of him, is very similar to a widespread practice amongst the Scottish clans, where if the chief was seen as being unsuited for the job or abusing his power, he could be replaced. This idea is itself rooted in the notion that the clan, like all tribal societies, consists of all its members, including the chief, whose special status arises from his direct descent from the original, real or imagined, founder of the clan. He is of the people, not over them, in direct contradiction to the ideas of feudalism, where the king is supreme under God. We should never forget that much of Scotland remained tribal for another 4 centuries after 1320. No one, as far as I'm aware, has ever investigated just what the relationship was between the signatories of this document and the people they lived among. Most commentators have been happy to go along with what I would suggest is the facile and heavily Anglo-centric notion that the signatories were all nobles, just like the feudal aristocracy of England. The evidence suggests otherwise, even if it is manifestly clear that many of their descendants wanted that to be the case, which is probably why so many of the current lairdy lot were educated at Eton and other so-called public schools. Now, it took 8 years for Pope John to remove what was known as the interdict on Scotland and to lift King Robert's excommunication, and it appears that despite the urging of the Pope, Edward II continued to claim suzerainty over Scotland, and it was only after the interdict was lifted that his son and successor Edward III, who had come to the throne the previous year, consented to signing a peace treaty with the Scots. This was known as the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, and in it Edward renounced all claims to Scotland. This was not popular amongst the English nobility, who saw it as a humiliation, and once he had settled into the job, Edward broke the treaty by declaring war on Scotland once again in 1333. However, the resistance of the Scots, who had initially been led by Wallace, Bruce Murray and others, had laid a pattern which was to continue for a long time afterwards. The Declaration of 1320 is seen by many Scots today as being important because of its acceptance by the Pope and for laying down the idea that in Scotland the people are sovereign, an idea that has been judicially reinforced several times and is, as I have said, directly opposed to the English concept of parliamentary sovereignty. It is also of considerable importance because we can see disturbing and virulently anti-democratic echoes of Edward I's policies in the current political administration in Westminster. With the lifting of the interdict and King Robert's excommunication, Scotland returned to the fold in terms of being a sovereign country and one of the international family of nations, but the struggle against the English continued. In this context, words matter, and as I have noted, we should never refer to this period as the Wars of Independence, as the subtext is that we are breaking away from England. Nothing could be further from the truth. And what the Declaration of Arbroath clearly does show us is that the sovereignty of our nation must always be at the heart of any struggle against any would-be oppressor. Next time, the wars go on.